Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we take a look at the open Sicilian. The Sicilian begins with the moves pawn to e4, and now pawn to c5. And with this move pawn to c5, black anticipates and aims to neutralize white's attempts to expand in the center with the move d2 to d4. And the overall idea is that when white plays d4, black will capture a center pawn with a flank pawn, leaving him with a 2-to-1 central pawn majority. However, in the open Sicilian, white happily accepts this situation, and he simply plays knight f3, aiming to play d4. And he's going to bank on a fantastic lead in development, which we'll take a look at today. Let's take a look. The open Sicilian starts with the moves e4, c5, and then knight to f3, and now pretty much no matter what black does, maybe d6 being his slight favorite in this position, white will play pawn to d4 and takes. And in the open Sicilian, black's two center pawns to white's one nearly always end up being a very annoying factor for white to face. In the Sicilian, black stakes many of his counter chances on the unique possibilities that are offered to him by this simple 2-to-1 pawn majority. And as it turns out, theory and practice demonstrate time and again that this factor of the position is extremely helpful for black and even offers him real dynamic chances. So why does white just willy-nilly go in for this exchange on the d4 square? Well, the main answer is that white nearly always gains a tremendous lead in development in the open Sicilian. Let's study these positions really closely and see why this happens. Now, right away, let's consider an interesting point which you may not have looked at before. When white opens the game with e4, he not only seizes important squares in the center, but he also contributes to the development of his king's bishop, and in certain cases, he also develops the queen. In contrast, when black plays the Sicilian, we can right away surmise that sooner or later, he's going to have to spend another move with his pawns in order to help develop his kingside bishop, since the move c5 does nothing to actually contribute to the development of a piece. Since piece development is usually more important than pawn moves, the Sicilian already incurs a slight risk that black will fall behind a move in piece development when he goes to deploy this bishop. To show an example of how this works, let's take a look at the variation known as the classical Sicilian, which begins with the moves knight to f6, knight c3, knight c6, and now, after white simply plays bishop g5, we run into this little issue which I talked about before. Since black's first move did nothing to contribute to the development of his dark-squared bishop, he is now going to have to use another pawn move. He plays pawn to e6 usually to bring out this bishop. Whereas white simply continues queen d2, bishop e7, castles queenside, and castles kingside. And now, while it may not seem like such a big deal, you'll notice that in this position that white has developed 4 pieces, 1, 2, 3, 4, and also managed to castle, whereas black has only managed to develop 3 pieces and has managed to castle. Also, white even has the right to move, so white has gained a little bit of piece development here, and this all stems from the fact that black's first move, pawn to c5, did nothing to contribute to piece development. We've discovered one way that white gets a little extra time for his piece development in the Sicilian. But there's an even bigger bonus tempo for white in the open Sicilian. Take a look at the basic position after pawn to e4, pawn to c5, knight f3, d6, and pawn to d4. And now black has no choice but to engage in the exchange c takes d4 and knight takes d4. And of course, he's happy to do this since he's banking on the 2-to-1 central majority to play out in his favor. But did you ever notice that the exchange on d4 actually grants white a free tempo for his development? Normally, we would expect that whenever it's black's turn, white will be 1 move ahead in development since he begins with the right to move. But in this case, white is 2 moves ahead since his knight has been allowed to move a second time to a more pleasant central square at no penalty whatsoever. This occurred because black initiated the exchange, and white's recapture on d4 contributes to his overall development. And anytime a player initiates an exchange and the recapturing party's recapturing move helps to advance his development, the recapturing party gains a tempo. Here are a couple of other examples of this similar principle. For example, if white would simply play the move pawn to d4, black takes, and in fact, queen takes d4 is a situation where it appears white has made 2 moves and black has made 0 at the moment. Of course, in this position, there is no value to the extra tempo because the queen's exposure will instantly cause white to lose whatever time he's gained, for example, with knight c6. But I do want to show that once this exchange happens on d4, there is simply a gain of tempo which takes place. To draw another interesting comparison, let's take a look at the Scotch opening, which begins with the moves pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight f3, knight c6, and now once again, in a very different position, pawn to d4, taking on d4, and knight takes d4. Now, has white gained a tempo? In fact, he has. It appears that in this position on the board, it looks like white has made 3 moves, 1, 2, 3, as opposed to black's 1, and so white has gained a tempo from this voluntary exchange on d4. However, here's where that notable difference between the movement of the e-pawn and the movement of the c-pawn comes out, and that is that black's move, pawn to e5, contributes to the development of his bishop and his queen, and black is able to make use of this fact in order to make sure that white does not profit too much from this extra tempo in this position. So for example, one way that black can do this is he can play the move bishop to c5, attacking the knight on d4. Now, clearly, if white were to play knight takes c6, he would dissolve 2 of the tempi that he invested in this knight, and so he would actually fall behind in development. And that's not to say that knight takes c6 is a bad move. It's used to sometimes damage the pawn structure. However, the most principled reaction would be bishop to e3, trying to maintain this knight on the centralized square. But black once again makes use of the fact that he can bring his pieces into the play a little bit more quickly, using the move queen to f6 to further pressure d4. And it's at this point that white finally has to make a concession with the move pawn to c3 in order to solidify the knight on d4. And it's because of this little move, a pawn move, which does not contribute to piece development, and which also takes away the ordinary square for this knight on b1. It's because of this little move that white's advantage in time has significantly diminished in its value. And this is mainly because of the fact that the move e5, as opposed to c5, contributes to the development of black's pieces. It's not going to be nearly as easy for black in the open Sicilian. After, let's say, pawn e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, pawn d4, takes, and takes, white has gained the tempo. And attempts to force white to make concessions by defending the knight or exchanging it simply won't succeed. Black simply doesn't have rapid enough development to ensure that this becomes a key factor in the position. Black has a harder time building a concentrated attack on the d4 knight, and often, if he does succeed, white is still okay with moving the knight to b3, where it still contributes to the overall development by helping to defend the queen side, and it also gets out of the way of the king side pawns, which will be useful in a pawn storm. Meanwhile, any measures which black took to force the knight to move away from d4 often have downsides of their own. For example, the most straightforward method of playing to usurp the knight on d4 is actually an early e5. In fact, this position would be one place where you could do this. But this seriously weakens the d5 square, and this is one of the major drawbacks of playing in this way. Whereas certain other plans involving an eventual queen b6 have the downside that this queen will often be vulnerable to an attack at a later point. Thus, we have established a second way that white profits in development in the open Sicilian. The exchange on d4 actually gives him a tempo which he is actually able to profit from, since the advanced knight can be adequately protected, and its movement away from the f3 square greatly contributes to his ability to deploy the f-pawn, which will definitely help in generating an attack in a later phase of the game. There is a third and final reason why black tends to fall so far behind in development in the open Sicilian. And this has to do with his tendency to play another little pawn move in the form of a7 to a6. And probably the best example of this is in the Najdorf Sicilian, which is the position arising after pawn to d6, pawn to d4, pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, knight f6, knight c3, and now simply this little move a6. And this is a very popular move with a very strong reputation. In fact, the careers of both Bobby Fischer and Garry Kasparov were enhanced greatly by playing these positions on the black side, and they both managed to do very well. And the idea in the current position is simply to, in the future, prepare b7 to b5, and at the same time, to deprive some of white's minor pieces of the b5 square. But of course, this is yet another pawn move, and so this contributes to white's overall increase in piece development. For example, after the moves bishop e2, e6, getting ready to bring that bishop into the game, and castles kingside, white has an impressive 4 pieces deployed, and he's managed to castle, whereas black has only 1 single piece deployed and has not yet managed to castle. And yet, this position has a very strong reputation for black, which should begin to tell you a little something about the inherent strength of these 2-to-1 pawns in the center, which are a major compensating factor for black. Time and time again, it has been shown that black gradually unfolds his pieces. He puts some pressure on the e4 pawn along the way, and he begins to expand his queenside pawns, and suddenly white finds that his development advantage has disappeared, and he's faced with substantial difficulties in addressing black's counterplay. During all of this time, white hopes to crash through with a winning attack based on his extra development, and he often succeeds, but the central pawns go a long way in slowing him down. Notice that they control quite a few squares. They control c5, d5, e5, f5, making it difficult for white to get into the position. And it's this factor which often gives black just the amount of time he needs to complete his development, keep his position solid, and later to turn the tables on white. In the end, both sides are taking important strategic risk in the open Sicilian. White, for example, gives up his center pawn, exchanges it for a flank pawn, but he does so in order to get a fantastic lead in development. If he can manage to crash through black's position before black is able to catch up in development, white will often be rewarded with a spectacular attacking victory. On the other hand, if he does not manage to crash through, black often completes his development and then relies upon this factor of the central pawn majority as well as other sorts of factors in the position to gain serious counter chances. This is the exciting paradox contained in the Sicilian, and it's the source of many of its basic mysteries. If you have an appetite for chess where deep strategy and imagination come to the forefront, then the Sicilian is worth examination for both sides. That's all for today. We'll see you soon.